The stench of death hung in the air. 4 days. 4 days since they had wrapped his body in burial cloths. 4 days since they had placed him in that cold, dark tomb. 4 days of weeping until there were no tears left to cry. Martha stood at the edge of the village, her eyes red and swollen, scanning the horizon for any sign of him. The one person who could have prevented this tragedy, the one who called himself their friend. "He's coming," someone whispered behind her. Martha's heart lurched. Hope and anger collided inside her chest as she spotted a group of men in the distance. She began running, dust swirling around her feet, grief and desperation driving every step. When she reached him, the words burst from her lips before she could stop them. Bethany was just 2 miles from Jerusalem, a small village nestled in the Judean hills. It was here that Jesus found a home away from home, in the humble dwelling of 3 siblings who had become dear friends: Martha, Mary, and their brother Lazarus. Their home wasn't grand, no marble columns or ornate decorations. Just a simple stone house with a courtyard where neighbors gathered to share stories under the shade of an olive tree. But whenever Jesus traveled near Jerusalem, this was where he stayed. Martha, the older sister, managed the household with efficient care. Mary, quieter and more contemplative, often sat at Jesus' feet, drinking in his every word. And Lazarus was the brother Jesus loved, a man whose quiet faith and friendship had formed a special bond with the teacher from Nazareth. But now, Lazarus lay dead in a tomb, and the sisters had sent word to Jesus days ago, "Lord, the one you love is sick." Yet Jesus hadn't come, not when Lazarus was fighting fever, not when his breathing grew labored, not when death finally claimed him, not even for the burial. 4 days had passed. In Jewish understanding, that meant more than just time. It meant Lazarus was truly, irrevocably dead. The soul, they believed, lingered near the body for 3 days. But on the 4th day, corruption had fully set in. Death had claimed permanent victory. Martha stood before Jesus, her body trembling with grief. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." The unspoken question burned in her heart. Why didn't you come? Yet even in her darkest moment, faith flickered like a stubborn flame. "But I know," she continued, "that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus looked at her with eyes that held the weight of divine purpose. "Your brother will rise again." Martha nodded wearily. "I know he will rise again on the resurrection at the last day." It was the proper answer, the theological answer she had been taught. But it offered little comfort for the raw wound of present grief. Then Jesus spoke words that would echo through eternity. "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die." His gaze held hers. "Do you believe this?" Something stirred within Martha's heart. Not just hope for some distant future, but something immediate and present. "Yes, Lord," she answered. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." Martha hurried back to the village, finding her sister Mary surrounded by mourners. Leaning close, she whispered, "The teacher is here and is asking for you." Mary rose quickly and left, the mourners following, thinking she was going to the tomb to weep. Instead, she ran to Jesus, falling at his feet in the same spot where Martha had met him. "Lord," she sobbed, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Jesus looked at Mary, crumpled at his feet. He saw the mourners wailing behind her, the full weight of human grief pressed against his heart, And then something extraordinary happened. The Bible tells us simply, Jesus wept. Two words that forever bridge the gap between divine power and human suffering. Tears streamed down the face of God in human flesh, not the calculated display of a distant deity, but the genuine anguish of a friend who loved deeply. The mourners whispered among themselves, "See how he loved him." But others voiced the question, tormenting the sisters, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus approached the tomb, a cave with a stone laid across the entrance, the finality of death made visible in cold, unyielding rock. "Take away the stone," Jesus commanded. Martha's practical nature resurfaced through her grief. "But Lord, by this time there was a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Think about this moment. What Martha was really saying was, "It's too late. The decay has started. The smell will be unbearable." In her mind, there was a point of no return, and they had crossed it. Death had won. Even Jesus had limits, but Jesus fixed his gaze on her. "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they rolled away the stone, revealing the dark entrance to the tomb. Jesus looked up to heaven and prayed aloud, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." Then Jesus did something that seemed absurd to everyone watching. He called into the tomb as if death were merely a temporary condition, as if the barrier between life and death was as thin as a whisper. "Lazarus, come out!" The crowd held their breath. The sisters clutched each other's hands. And then, movement from within the darkness, a shuffling sound, something emerging from the shadows. And there, standing in the entrance of his own tomb, was Lazarus, still bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in burial cloth, but unmistakably, impossibly alive. "Take off the grave clothes," Jesus said quietly, "and let him go." Imagine this scene, the gasps of the crowd, the sisters frozen in disbelief, and Lazarus blinking in the sunlight he never thought to see again, being unwrapped like a gift returned from death itself. First his face, pale but flushed with returning life. Then his hands, the same hands that had grown cold in death now warm with flowing blood. His feet, legs, body, all freed from the bindings of death. The sisters collapsed around their brother, touching his face, his hands, sobbing with joy beyond words. Lazarus held them, his own eyes wide with wonder, struggling to comprehend his journey from death back to life. The crowd erupted, some falling to their knees in worship, others backing away in fear. Some ran toward Jerusalem, unable to contain the news of what they had witnessed. Death itself had been defeated before their eyes. Word spread like wildfire through Judea. A man dead 4 days had walked out of his tomb at the command of Jesus of Nazareth. For many who witnessed or heard about the miracle, it became impossible to deny who Jesus was. John's Gospel tells us, "Therefore many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. But not everyone received the miracle with joy. Some reported what had happened to the Pharisees, who called a meeting of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council. 'Here is this man performing many signs,' they said. 'If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation.' From that day on, the religious leaders plotted to kill Jesus. The miracle that brought Lazarus back from the dead set in motion the events that would lead Jesus to his own death. And in a twist of divine irony, The greatest demonstration of Jesus' power over death would lead directly to his own confrontation with the grave. But most remarkably, Lazarus himself became a walking testimony, a living, breathing witness to Jesus' power. So much so that the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well, for on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and believing in him. The story of Lazarus echoes across centuries into our lives today. Let's unwrap the profound lessons hidden within this miracle. First, notice Jesus' timing. When he heard Lazarus was sick, he waited 2 more days before leaving. To the sisters, his delay seemed like indifference. To Jesus, it was about revealing God's glory in a greater way. How often do we interpret God's timing as absence? How frequently do we mistake his divine delays for divine denial? Martha and Mary both greeted Jesus with the same painful words, "Lord, if you had been here." It was both accusation and confession of faith. They knew Jesus could have healed their brother. They didn't yet understand he could do even more. Sometimes God's greatest work begins after what we perceive as his failure to act. His silence doesn't mean absence. His delay doesn't mean denial. Second, consider Jesus' tears. Before demonstrating his power over death, he first demonstrated his solidarity with our pain. The shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept, may also be one of the most profound. The God who could banish death with a word first chose to experience the full weight of our grief. He didn't scold Martha and Mary for their sorrow. He joined them in it. This is our God, not distant and unfeeling, but intimately acquainted with our suffering. When you weep, remember, Jesus wept too. Third, look at how Jesus called Lazarus. He didn't just say, "Come out." He called him by name. "Lazarus, come out." Early Christian writers noted that if Jesus hadn't specified Lazarus, every dead person might have risen at his command. Jesus knows your name. He calls you personally. His power is universal, but his love is specific. Finally, notice Jesus' command after the miracle. Take off the grave clothes and let him go. Lazarus was alive but still bound. He needed others to help free him from the remnants of death. How many of us have experienced spiritual resurrection, but still carry the grave clothes of our old life? How many need a community of faith to help unwrap the bindings of old habits, destructive thoughts, and sinful patterns? Maybe you're standing where Martha stood, at the edge of your hope, scanning the horizon for Jesus while death seems to have the final word in your situation. Perhaps you're like Mary, collapsed at Jesus' feet, your faith mixed with bitter disappointment, wondering why he didn't come sooner. Or maybe you're Lazarus, alive but still bound, needing help to remove the grave clothes that restrict your new life. Wherever you find yourself in this story, remember this: Jesus never arrives too late. His timing may not match our expectations, but it always fulfills his greater purpose. When Jesus finally arrived in Bethany, Martha said, "Lord, if you had been here." She was looking backward, focused on what might have been. Jesus redirected her. "I am the resurrection and the life. Not I will be or I was, but I am." Present tense. Here. Now the same Jesus who stood before Lazarus' tomb stands before whatever situation seems dead in your life, a relationship that feels beyond repair, a dream that's been buried, a hope that's stopped breathing, a faith that's grown cold. And he asks the same question he asked Martha. Do you believe this? Not, do you understand all my ways? Or, do you comprehend my timing? But simply, do you believe that I am who I say I am? The raising of Lazarus wasn't just a powerful miracle. It was a preview, a foretaste of what Jesus himself would experience just weeks later. After bringing Lazarus back to life, Jesus set his face toward Jerusalem, knowing the religious leaders were now determined to kill him. The life he gave to Lazarus would cost him his own. But unlike Lazarus, who would eventually face death again, as all mortals do, Jesus' resurrection would be permanent, the first fruits of a new kind of life altogether. As Paul would later write, Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. Jesus didn't just conquer death temporarily, he defeated it eternally. And here's where the story of Lazarus touches your life most directly. The same voice that called, "Lazarus, come out," calls to each of us. Not just to physical resurrection someday, but to spiritual resurrection today. Jesus says to you, come out of the tomb of shame that holds you captive. Come out of the grave of guilt that keeps you bound. Come out of the darkness of doubt that blinds your eyes. Come out of the death of sin that separates you from life. And when you respond to his voice, he then turns to those around you and says, help unwrap them from their grave clothes. Set them free to truly live. The miracle at Bethany forces us to answer the question Jesus asked Martha. Do you believe this? Do you believe that Jesus is the resurrection and the life? Do you believe that physical death is not the end of your story? Do you believe that spiritual death doesn't have to be your present reality? If you do, then live like Lazarus, as walking proof of Christ's power over death. Live as evidence that God can bring life from the most hopeless situations. Remember that Lazarus never spoke a word in this story. His testimony wasn't what he said, but who he was, a man who had been dead and was now alive. Your greatest testimony may not be your words, but your life, the visible difference between who you were and who you are because of Jesus. When people looked at Lazarus, they saw living proof of Jesus' power. When people look at you, what do they see? The religious leaders wanted to kill Lazarus because on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus. His very existence was a threat to those who denied Christ's power. Your transformed life, your spiritual resurrection, may also threaten those who want to deny. At the heart of this miracle stands this truth. Jesus meets our greatest fear, death itself, with his astonishing claim, I am the resurrection and the life. Not just a healer, not just a teacher, not just a good man, but life itself. Resurrection personified. Standing at the mouth of that tomb in Bethany, Jesus proved he has authority over our most inescapable enemy. And from that same mouth came the words that still echo through eternity. Whoever believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. In your darkest moments, when hope seems sealed behind an immovable stone, listen for his voice calling your name. And when you hear it, come out. This has been Hidden Heroes of Faith. If this message touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear that Jesus still calls dead things back to life. Until next time, remember, the same power that raised Lazarus from the grave lives in you through Christ Jesus.